If you know anything about the Atkins diet, you know that Atkins and donuts do not go together. And those who are on, I have a friend who's on the Atkins diet, and those who are on the Atkins diet tend to compare their results with, say, those who are on the South Beach diet, or with those who aren't on any diet, and maybe are eating too many donuts and should be on a donut-free diet. Many of us compare things like that, our diets, judging what is good and what is bad for us. We make judgments about our diets through comparisons, usually by comparing our physiques. We have a tendency to do this with many things. We make comparisons all the time. We compare ourselves to others in different areas, many different areas. And it can become a competition through comparisons to determine who's better. And we usually compare ourselves with someone we judge to be inferior to ourselves so that we can feel better about ourselves. Which reminds me of a parishioner who walked up to the priest one Sunday after Mass, pumped his hand and said, "Excellent homily, Father. Everything you said applies to someone or another I know." That's one of the effects of original sin, to compare ourselves to a much lower bar or lower common denominator, to judge others, thereby avoiding taking a hard look at ourselves and what needs to be redeemed in us. Today, Jesus introduces two characters in need of redemption. One's the Pharisee and the other's a tax collector. The Pharisee prays to himself, we hear, to himself, a play on words, by himself and literally to himself, as opposed to God. His prayer is all about himself. What a good person I am, he's saying. He congratulates himself for all his good deeds and accomplishments. And by comparison, he goes on to condemn the tax collector for his bad deeds. The tax collector, on the other hand, is quick to admit his sinfulness, clearly aware of his unworthiness before God. But he begs for forgiveness anyway. He does not compare himself with anyone else except God. And so it is God who is his bar or his standard. And then we hear Jesus pass judgment, as only God can do. He declares the tax collector justified, in other words, in a right relationship with God, and the Pharisee is not. See, the tax collector knows that he is less than God and needs God's help. The Pharisee wants to put himself on the same level with God. Now, Jesus does not mean that the prideful Pharisee was wrong in his good deeds, nor does he mean that the tax collector was right in his bad deeds. What Jesus is judging is their attitude, how they stand and place themselves before God, their approach to God and neighbor. The Pharisee is wrong to compare himself to others. He is wrong for not really relying on God, giving God the glory and the praise and the credit for his accomplishments. You see, the prideful really have no need for God. So in his arrogance, the Pharisee plays God by passing judgment on others. His so-called success in piety led him to believe that he was really better than his neighbor. And I think this is something that plagues us as a culture. It's a real danger in our culture because we tend to compare ourselves with the culture. Again, the lowest common denominator, and think that we are doing pretty good, or at least we're not doing all that bad when compared with all the bad we see out there. You know, one example might be the internet. There things are done virtually. And one might think that, well, it's not really bad for me to view these inappropriate images or materials on the internet because they're not real. I'm not really engaging in that. But still, that kind of behavior is very dangerous. And yes, those are real people in those images. It's not that virtual, not that unreal. If we were to compare only behaviors, the Pharisee was better than the tax collector. However, we will not be judged according to how good we are as compared to others. We will be judged on how good we are as compared to God. The tax collector seemed to understand this. For when he compared himself to God, what does he do? He declares himself a sinner. It's what we do each time when we gather for the Mass. One of the very first things we do is the act of contrition. We declare ourselves to be sinners and therefore in need to be here with the divine physician, Jesus Christ. Here at the Eucharist, we are reminded that there are no comparisons, no competitions, no room for self-righteousness. What we do here at Mass is not like what we do when we go out and eat in a restaurant, where there are many tables, and we get to pick our table, and sometimes, but mainly, we have a table by ourselves, and we don't want people who might annoy us or who look offensive. We don't want them strangers joining our table. It's the reason why we have our own table. Here we don't have separate tables. We have one table that we gather around. Here we sit at the same table of the Lord, and here we do not compare diets. Here we share the same food, Jesus Christ. Here we do not measure our holiness against one another, for we are sure to find someone who is not as good or as holy as I am, as we are. Instead, we measure our holiness against God, God's holiness. And as I said, when we do that, here we all stand before God as sinners in need of redemption. Here we recall that the Eucharist is to make us into one holy body, the body of Christ. A body that does not compete against itself. Here, we allow God to set the bar for our holiness. He is our standard, and He is the one who helps us reach that goal, that standard. And so, Atkins and donuts may not go together, but more importantly, neither does self-righteousness go together with a holy life in God.